Before you listen, if you enjoy the stories and want to hear more, then please consider subscribing. Most of you listening aren't subscribed, so please take this time to subscribe. Turn on notifications so you'll never miss a story and be the first to hear. You'll also be supporting me. Thank you. I've always been enamored with the mystery of old places, the tales they whisper in the wind, the secrets etched into their stone walls. I'd long yearned to see Scotland, famous for its rugged beauty and castles, each one a world in itself, a monument to history. So when I got an opportunity to travel, I didn't think twice before booking my tickets for a weekend trip. The tickets were so cheap, it was a steal. Landing at Edinburgh Airport, I could already sense the ancient charm that Scotland was renowned for, a place where history and modernity coexisted seamlessly. Edinburgh's cityscape, the cobblestone streets, and the occasional sight of a kilt-clad Scotsman only amplified my excitement for the days to come. The following day, we set out for one of the many castles dotting the Scottish landscape. The castle we were to visit was perched atop a rocky cliff, its silhouette proudly interrupting the horizon. The closer we got, the more I felt a growing awkwardness, a cold tingle creeping up my spine. I blamed it on the biting Scottish wind, but somewhere deep within I knew it was more than that. The castle was a grand yet imposing sight, its weathered stone walls standing tall against time. Our tour group, all tourists like myself, shuffled through the castle's many rooms, each one a time capsule preserving a bygone era. I absorbed the fascinating stories the guides shared about the castle's previous inhabitants, their lives, their triumphs, and their downfalls. But with each passing tale, the agitation I felt earlier didn't dissipate, but instead grew stronger. In the midst of the tour, as we navigated through a dim and low-lit ancient corridor, I heard a familiar voice, soft but unmistakably clear. It was my dad's voice calling my name from further down the hallway. My heart raced. Dad wasn't with us on this trip. He was back home, hundreds of miles away. They say curiosity kills the cat. Well, I broke away from the tour group and followed the sound deeper into the labyrinthine castle. The hallway was long, narrow, and poorly lit, the air growing colder with each step. I could see my breath in the air, the dim light casting long, eerie shadows that danced upon the stone walls. The whispers of history seemed louder here, almost like the castle itself was trying to tell me something. But the voice of my dad was all I could focus on. It felt so real, so urgent, like he was right there with me. As I neared the end of the hallway, the voice became fainter, almost drowned out by the sound of my own heartbeat echoing in my ears. It was then I felt it, a cold, firm hand on my shoulder. It gripped me so suddenly and I froze, expecting to see my dad when I turned around. But there was nothing but a cold breeze, only the dim light illuminating the empty hallway. The chilling touch was gone as quickly as it came, leaving only a cold dread in its wake. I screamed so loud. My scream echoed through the castle's corridors, a loud, jarring contrast to the silence that had just been. Then everything went black. All I remember then was waking up in an office room situated in the castle. I was surrounded by concerned faces, the sharp smell of antiseptic cutting through the musty air of the castle. The paramedics were calm and efficient, their practiced movements a stark contrast to my own disarray. My shoulder throbbed with a dull ache, and when I glanced down, I saw a distinct bruise, the shape of a hand distinctly visible against my skin. The next few hours were a whirlwind of activity. I was whisked away to the local hospital for a checkup while the rest of the tour group carried on, their excited chatter a stark contrast to my quiet contemplation. The incident left me shaken, the echo of my dad's voice and the phantom grip on my shoulder still lingering in my mind. I left Scotland a few days later, the awe-inspiring beauty of the landscape now tinged with a touch of eerie mystery. The castle, once a symbol of grandeur and history, had now become a source of personal horror. The incident at the castle remains an unsolved enigma, an eerie memory that scared the living daylights out of me. Even now, as I sit thousands of miles away from that ancient castle in Scotland, I can't shake off the chilling sensation of that cold hand on my shoulder, the echo of my dad's voice in my ear. I can only wonder about the secrets the castle still holds, the stories yet untold. That weekend trip to Scotland was meant to be a vacation, a break from the everyday life. Little did I know it would end up being a chilling encounter that would stay with me forever. As a child, I always admired my Uncle Theo's adventurous spirit. He had an unending fascination with the obscure and the mysterious, an aspect of his personality that often manifested in his choice of abodes. When he asked me to help him move into a Victorian-era house he recently purchased, I couldn't refuse. Sure, it would be hard work, but the prospect of spending time with Uncle Theo, wrapped in the enigmatic allure of an old house, was too tempting to resist. Arriving at his old home, I was greeted with the familiar sight of a house full of oddities, each piece a testament to my uncle's eccentric interests. We dove straight into the process of moving his collection of artifacts, books, and whatnots. After hours of careful packing and unpacking, his new home began to take shape, adopting the peculiar character of its new owner. During our lunch break, Uncle Theo shared stories about the previous owners of the Victorian house, their lives marked by joy, sorrow, and mystery. The tales, while fascinating, added an eerie undertone to the atmosphere of the house. Yet I'd brushed off the spooky feeling as a mere side effect of the stories and the antiquity of the house. Post-lunch, we resumed our task. Uncle Theo went upstairs to organize his belongings while I handled the heavy boxes downstairs. Amid the monotony of my task, I heard a rustling sound from above along with the sound of struggle. Assuming it was my uncle struggling with something, I headed upstairs to lend him a hand. After all, he is quite old. The upstairs was a labyrinth of rooms branching off a long, narrow hallway. The sound seemed to come from the last room, a closed door veiled in semi-darkness. A sense of fear crept over me, but I shrugged it off and pushed the door wide open, flooding the room with light. I expected to see my uncle there, but to my surprise, the room was empty, just a few unopened boxes. There was no sign of Uncle Theo. I was shocked and frozen in fear. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't even move. The eeriness of the situation began to set in when, from the still silence, I heard my uncle's voice calling my name from downstairs. Now I was more in shock. I clearly heard rustling coming from this room and my uncle grunting as he was moving things. My mind raced to find a rational explanation, but my thoughts were drowned out by the thudding of my heart. The room felt colder, the silence heavier, and my fear more profound. I finally found my legs and crept away, but while I was on the brink of retreating, I heard it. A soft, chilling giggle emanating from the seemingly empty room. The giggle was low, barely audible, but it echoed in the silent room, piercing the heavy atmosphere. It was a sound so out of place, so unsettling that my legs almost gave out completely. The room now seemed to hold a sinister air, the flickering light casting eerie shadows on the bare walls. I turned and bolted, my heart pounding against my ribs so tight. I stumbled down the staircase, the chilling giggle echoing in my ears. I found Uncle Theo downstairs. Unaware of the terrifying experience I'd just endured, I tried to speak to explain, but words failed me. The fear was too raw, too fresh. So we continued with the move in silence, the eerie encounter remaining our unspoken secret. The remainder of the day was marked by a profound tension. Every creak, every rustle sent jolts of fear through me. The once charming Victorian house had taken on a menacing persona, its old-world charm replaced by an inexplicable dread. As I drove back home that night, the unsettling experience replayed in my mind. The fear, the giggle, and the inexplicable noises had transformed what should have been a day of familial bonding and hard work into something far more sinister. The once familiar and comforting image of Uncle Theo's house was now tainted with a sense of presentiment. Every glance at the rear-view mirror half expected to catch a glimpse of that eerie upstairs room, its memory relentlessly haunting me. Over the next few days, I found myself increasingly preoccupied with the incident. The sound of the chilling giggle, the cold, empty room, they all lingered in my mind, refusing to fade away. Each time I closed my eyes, I was back in that room, surrounded by darkness and fear. I couldn't escape it, no matter how hard I tried. I debated telling Uncle Theo about what happened, but I was unsure. Would he believe me? Or would he dismiss it as a trick of the mind, a result of the long, tiring day we had? I was torn between my desire for answers and the fear of the unknown. I also didn't want to spoil his impressions on his new house. Time didn't lessen the fear, it only embedded it deeper into my consciousness. I found myself avoiding anything that reminded me of that day. I started to decline Uncle Theo's invitations for visits, inventing excuses that felt silly even to my own ears. The once cherished bond with my uncle began to strain under the weight of my unshared experience. The Victorian house, which once promised a new adventure, had become a symbol of an unsolved mystery that I wanted to forget but couldn't. My encounter with the inexplicable had left an indelible mark on my psyche, turning a simple act of helping my uncle into a chilling narrative that I would carry with me for the rest of my life. Even today, as I recount the incident, all I could do is shudder. The memory, though faded, still holds the power to send chills down my spine. I can't explain what happened that day, and perhaps I will never be able to. All I know is that I ventured into my uncle's Victorian house one Sunday afternoon, and walked out with a haunting experience that forever changed the way I perceived the unknown. I remember the night clear as day. A seemingly ordinary evening spent at my friend's apartment, on the verge of transforming into a living nightmare that I cannot explain at all to this day. See, my friend, let's call her Jenna, lived in this old, refurbished building. The kind that held more than its fair share of stories, and perhaps even secrets. She had invited me over for a sleepover after a long week for work. It was a chance to catch up and watch our favorite TV shows. The apartment was a juxtaposition of modern living against old school architecture. Jenna had a knack for interior design, and she had certainly done a number on this place. From the plush velvet drapes that danced in the rhythm of the wind to the rustic wooden floorboards that creaked with every step, it was an embodiment of her personality, a mix of the old and the new. I was to sleep in the guest room, a small, cozy space with a single bed and an ancient-looking television set. It was one of those old tube TVs, the kind you don't see around anymore. I remember teasing Jen about it, and she had laughed it off, saying it added character to the room. Little did we know that this harmless piece of vintage technology would be the harbinger of a night I wish I could forget. As it got later in the night, Jenna and I parted ways, she to her room and I to the guest room. I remember snuggling under the warm blanket, the rhythmic ticking of the clock lulling me into a deep slumber. Suddenly, I woke up disoriented. The room was bathed in an eerie glow, and the TV was on, a snowy stag dancing on the screen. I figured I must have accidentally rolled over the remote. Shaking off the grogginess, I turned it off and drifted back into sleep. But it happened again and again. Each time I woke up to find the TV switched on, static buzzing in the background. It was inexplicable, unsettling, and increasingly frustrating. It just kept turning on. At the third instance, I decided to put an end to it. I pulled out the plug from the wall socket, hoping to finally get a peaceful night's sleep. But I was wrong. Suddenly, the room was filled with the same eerie glow, the static sound ricocheting off the walls. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest, as I watched the TV come to life, a plugless entity blaring static noise despite having no power. But this time, it was different. Amidst the crackling static, a distorted voice echoed, unintelligible yet terrifyingly present. The air in the room felt heavy, a sense of dread blanketing over me. The supernatural spectacle left me paralyzed, my throat dry and my mind racing with fright. With every ounce of courage I had left, I mustered the strength to bolt out of the room, racing toward Jenna's room, the voice growing fainter with each step. But when I reached Jenna, she was in a deep sleep, oblivious to my terror. I tried to wake her, but she remained undisturbed, a peaceful contrast to the nightmare I was living. My mind screamed at me a leave to escape from this unholy terror. I rushed back to the guest room, intending to grab my stuff and bolt. But the TV was off. The room was back to its original state, the only sound being the steady tick-tock of the clock. It was as if the entire incident was a figment of my imagination. But I knew what I had seen, what I had heard. I knew I wasn't dreaming. Despite the creeping fear, I woke Jen up, my voice trembling as I told her I was leaving. She was confused but didn't question my panic-stricken face. I packed my belongings in a hurried frenzy, my eyes darting around the room, half expecting the TV to spring back to life. As I rushed out of the apartment, I glanced back one last time at the guest room, the window casting an ominous glow in the moonlight. I could almost hear the echo of that distorted voice, a chilling reminder of the night's events. I drove back home in a haze, the city lights blurring past my windows. The eerie silence of the night was periodically punctuated by the distant sounds of nightlife, a stark contrast to the harrowing experience I'd just had. The static noise, the distorted voice, the unplugged TV. It all felt like a surreal nightmare, and yet the cold sweat on my forehead and the rapid beating of my heart testified to its frightening reality. When I finally reached my apartment, the safety of my familiar surroundings offered a modicum of comfort, but sleep was a distant dream. I kept replaying the events in my mind, unable to comprehend what had transpired. I tried to rationalize it, to find a logical explanation, but the fear that clung to me like a second skin made it impossible. I called Jenna and told her what happened. Eventually, she didn't believe me and thought it was a nightmare. But I can assure you all, there was something weird about that TV. The day Grandma passed, everything took a surreal turn. I mean, we all knew it was coming. She was old, her health had been failing. But knowing something in theory and living it are two vastly different things. The funeral was a blur, a black and white mosaic of crying faces, hushed whispers, and the cold, indifferent gray of the tombstone. Grandma's house was this charming little place tucked away in the countryside. A relic from a simpler time, filled with porcelain dolls, antique furniture, and her precious collection of old records. To us grandkids, it was like a museum of nostalgia, a treasure trove of stories from a time we never knew. After the funeral, my cousins, Dylan, Mia, and I decided to stay at Grandma's house for one last time. It was a sort of unspoken agreement among us. We wanted to relive the childhood summers we spent there, the laughter, the games, the love, everything that was quintessentially Grandma. The first night, we stayed up late, reminiscing about the good times, echoing her house with our laughter like we used to. But as the night deepened, so did the shadows around us, replacing our cheerfulness with an eerie silence. We retired to our respective rooms, the old wooden floors creaking under our weight, the house groaning like it missed her too. The next morning, things started getting weird. I woke up to find Grandma's sewing kit open on the dining table. Now, Grandma loved sewing. She used to say it kept her hands busy and mind calm. The sight of the open kit, the threads scatter, the needle threaded as if waiting for her touch, sent a cold pain down my neck. It was like a silent echo of her presence, a grim reminder of her absence. I thought maybe it was left like that and we didn't notice it. I showed it to Dylan and Mia, their faces mirroring my confusion and dread. We couldn't make sense of it. Was it one of us, sleepwalking perhaps? Or did we forget to pack it away? We just couldn't remember. The following days were stranger still. Things would move, disappear, then reappear. The rocking chair in the living room would sway on its own. We would catch whiffs of her perfume in the hallway. The air felt heavy, charged, as if it was keeping a secret. The house seemed to have taken a life of its own, mirroring our denial, our unwillingness to let her go. The nights were worse. I would hear the soft hum of her lullaby floating down the corridors, the one she used to sing when we couldn't sleep. The sound of her sewing machine would echo from her room, the rhythmic whirring and uncanny lullaby in the stillness of the night. It was as if the house was stuck in a time loop, living and reliving its days with Grandma. One particular night, the air was thick with the scent of her baking, the sweet, buttery aroma of her famous apple pie. It was so strong, so real, that for a moment I could almost see her in the kitchen, her apron dusted with flour, her eyes twinkling with joy. I won't lie, it scared us. It scared us a lot. Yet, in a twisted way, it also comforted us. It was like she was still there, in the creaking floors, the swaying chair, the lullabies that lulled us to sleep. It was like the house was grieving with us, refusing to let her go, just like us. We never talked about it outside the house. Who would believe us anyway? But we knew what we experienced. It was our unspoken bond with the house, a silent understanding. Grandma was still with us in her own way. One day, while going through her stuff, I found her diary. It was old and worn, its pages yellowed with age. It smelled of her, of lavender and old paper. Flipping through the pages was like taking a walk down memory lane. Her words, her stories, they all came to life, filling the room with her essence. But it was the last entry that caught my attention. It was dated the day before she passed. In her shaky handwriting, she had written about how much she loved her house and us. She had written that even after she's gone, she wished to be around, watching over us, being a part of our lives. I asked myself, was it her then? Was she the one behind all the strange happenings? The thought was chilling, yet oddly comforting. It was like she was fulfilling her last wish in the only way she could. Now, whenever I miss her, I just close my eyes and imagine her house. The smell of her baking, The sound of her sewing machine, her lullaby floating in the air. It's not the same, I know, but it's enough. It's enough to know that in some way she's still around, still watching over us. It was a day much like any other, except for the fact that I was home alone. The word alone had a different weight to it at 12, still carrying a flavor of adventure rather than the weary loneliness it suggests now. My parents were at work, and I was relishing the independence of a weekday afternoon, free from the watchful eyes of adults. My house was a nice little two-story affair, tucked away in the heart of the suburbs, a realm where the echo of lawnmowers became a symphony, and the shrill cries of children playing nearby served as background noise. The air was thick with the scent of freshly cut grass and the faint perfume of blooming flowers, signs that spring was in full swing. Normally, I'd be outside, soaking up the sun, playing with the neighborhood kids, but that day, I felt an uncharacteristic need for solitude. I enjoyed the quiet that the house offered, a stark contrast to the noise outside. A sort of tranquility, amplified by the muted hum of the refrigerator and the faint tick-tock of the wall clock. Things started to get odd when the knocking started, sharp raps against the front door. It seemed to slice through the silence, each knock sounding louder than the last. The house was never completely silent, you understand. There was always a low hum of electricity, the occasional groan of the old wooden structure. But this was different. It was an intrusion, a violation of the sanctuary I had built for myself. I was curious to see what that knocking was. I tiptoed to the living room, careful not to make a sound. I peeked through the window blinds, but there was nothing out of the ordinary, just the familiar scene of neatly manicured lawns and quiet homes. I turned to our smart home system, a gift from my tech-savvy uncle, and checked the front door camera. The color drained from my face as I saw a masked figure standing ominously at our doorstep. The figure wore a mask, something plain and plastic that covered their entire face, their expression obscured. The figure was just standing there, a stark contrast against our cheery yellow door. It was eerie how still they were, how they seemed to be looking straight into the camera, straight at me. I felt a chill run down my spine, a sensation of icy fingers tracing my vertebrae. Fighting the rising panic, I picked up my phone and dialed my mom's number. She was always the calm one in any situation, her comforting presence something I desperately needed. I didn't speak, couldn't speak. Instead, I held my breath, hiding under my bed, praying she'd understand the urgency in my silence. The wait was agonizing, every second stretching into an eternity. I could hear my heartbeat in my chest, a wild, erratic rhythm that threatened to drown out all other sounds. I clung to the phone, my only lifeline, my fingers white-knuckled around the device. Finally, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway reached my ears, a surge of relief washing over me. I heard the familiar creak of the front door, my mom's voice calling out my name. I crawled up from under the bed, my legs shaky, my heart still racing. She checked the front door, then the camera footage. I watched her face, expecting to see the same fear that had gripped me. But instead, there was confusion, then concern. The footage was missing. There was no recorded footage of that incident. It showed nothing out of the ordinary. No masked figure, no ominous knocking. Nothing. We checked the entire house together, every nook and cranny, every conceivable hiding place. Nothing was out of place. At this point, my mom thought I was just pranking her, and she didn't believe me at all. After my mother dismissed my claims as a prank, I started feeling like I was losing my mind. Was I hallucinating? Did I imagine the whole thing? I even began questioning my own memory, wondering if I had somehow fabricated the terrifying encounter. But as days passed, the fear persisted. Every creak, every shadow, every unexplained noise made my heart race. I began to avoid being alone in the house, always finding an excuse to stay at a friend's place or tagging along with my mother on errands. However, the strange occurrences did not stop. My mother would sometimes return home to find things slightly out of place, as if someone had been there while we were away. We checked the security footage again and again, but there was never anything to see. That event traumatized me, and to this day, I still get a little scared whenever I am left alone. I have this scary story for you, so listen. It was supposed to be a fun weekend with my friends in the great outdoors, but it quickly turned into a nightmare I will never forget. We set up camp in a clearing deep in the woods, far from civilization. The sun was setting, and the trees cast long shadows as we started a campfire and cooked dinner. We told ghost stories and joked around, enjoying the peacefulness of nature. As the night wore on and it got late, we settled into our tents and tried to sleep. I was lying on my back, staring at the ceiling of my tent when I heard a faint rustling in the bushes. At first, I thought it was just an animal, but then I heard it again. It was getting closer. I sat up, listening intently. My heart was racing as the rustling got louder and louder. Suddenly, I heard a blood-curdling scream. It was unlike anything I had ever heard before, a high-pitched, guttural shriek that had me frozen in place. I was freaked out. I jumped out of my tent and ran towards the direction of the sound. My friends were already up and grabbing flashlights. We followed the sound, which seemed to be coming from deep in the woods. The trees were so thick that it was hard to see anything, but we could hear the screams getting louder and more frequent. We were all scared, but we couldn't just ignore the sound. It sounded like someone or something was in pain, and we had to investigate. As we got deeper into the woods, the screams were so loud that they echoed through the trees. It was as if something was being tortured, and we could hear the agony in every cry. And suddenly the screams stopped. We stopped too, listening intently for any other sounds. But there was nothing, just silence. We stood there for what felt like hours, but it was only a few minutes. We were too scared to move, too scared to speak. Then, out of nowhere, a shadow appeared in front of us. It was tall and dark and pierced through the darkness. We couldn't see its face, but we could feel its presence. It was like nothing I had ever seen before, something otherworldly and terrifying. We all froze, too scared to move. The figure just stood there, watching us. We could feel its malevolent energy radiating towards us, making it hard to breathe. Then, just like that, it disappeared into the darkness. We were left standing there, shaking and terrified. We didn't know what had just happened, but we knew we had to leave. We ran back to our campsite, packed up our things, and drove home as fast as we could. We never talked about it again, but we all knew what we saw that night. To this day, I still have nightmares about the screams in the woods and the figure with a menacing stature. I don't know what happened that night, but I know that it was something I never want to experience again. It wasn't until a few weeks later that I learned the truth about what happened that night. I was talking to a local ranger who knew the woods like the back of his hand. When I described the screams and the figure, he went white as a sheet. He told me that the woods we were camping in were known to be haunted. According to local legend, a young girl had been murdered in those woods years ago, and her spirit was said to still roam the area. The ranger went on to explain that the screams we heard could have been the girl's ghostly cries for help, still trapped in the woods and unable to find peace. As for the figure, he believed it was the malevolent spirit of the person who had killed her, still lurking in the shadows and tormenting her soul. Thanks for listening in. If you like these stories and want to hear more, then please subscribe and like and support this new channel. We have more stories for you to listen to.